Thank you for joining our webinar, Managing Young Stock, Your Questions Answered. My name's Jodie Rosé O'Brien and I'm part of the AWI Extension South Australia team. Today's webinar is supported by Australian Wool Innovation, the South Australian Sheep Industry Fund and the Department of Primary Industries and Regions. For more information about AWI Extension, you can go to our website, and I encourage you to follow us on X and Facebook. Today we have two speakers. Firstly, Deb Scammell from Talking Livestock, who probably needs no introduction. But Deb is a livestock consultant where she assists producers with nutrition and production planning in their sheep and beef enterprises. She consults directly to farmers and runs industry courses and projects, and Deb is based in the Clare Valley. Our second speaker is Colin Trengove from Pro Ag Consulting. Cole has been the principal of Pro Ag Consulting, a whole farm consultancy-based firm, since 1996. With a background in farming, he led to a career and interest in ruminant nutrition and health. His passion is to optimise animal health and welfare and production through better understanding of nutrition and sustainable livestock production. So we've got Deb and Cole. We're going to give some short introductory remarks, and then we're going to move on to all the questions that you submitted through the webinar. So thanks, Deb.
Thanks everyone for joining tonight. What I'm going to start with is just young animal requirements and targets. So as Jodie said, we've left a lot of time for questions. So I'm just going to go through some of the basics for about 10 minutes. And we've got many questions that we've had prior to the webinar, but feel free to type some more in the chat box if you like, as you're hearing me speak, if you've got any other queries on anything I'm going to cover. But I guess most of the South Australia now, or even nationally, we've sort of got lambs on the ground, people at sort of varying weaning times, and now we're moving through to this young animal growth. And, you know, in most areas now, at least I'm seeing some reasonable pasture base. Some areas are still a bit behind with some of those shorter sort of pastures where we're still having to do small amounts of supplement to hit targets. But what I'm going to cover tonight is just some of these growth rate targets, depending on your class of stock. I'm going to talk a little bit about ewe recovery. So, you know, I think realistically, we did see some effect of delayed weaning or ewes not quite in adequate condition score. So I'll talk about how we can make sure we hit targets with the ewes for next year's joining. I'll talk about nutritional targets so we can hit these growth rate targets, and also limiting nutrients are where we might find we're missing something and not hitting the targets that we have set for ourselves. So firstly, when we look at setting targets, it really depends on the class of stock, but also I've put up some common sort of targets depending on the standard reference weight of your ewe. So if you don't know the standard reference weight of your ewe, the first thing I'd encourage you to do post-weaning is just weigh some dry ewes that are in condition score 3, and then you need to take the fleece weight off. So we basically want them bare shorn in condition score 3 and not pregnant to work out your standard reference weight. Because as you can see, a lot of these targets are based on percentage of adult weight. So I've got there your birth weight targets that are generally about 8 to 9% of the standard reference weight. And then also our weaning targets. So, you know, if you're still coming up to weaning, we've done some good webinars a month or so ago on weaning, and also one last year on sort of early weaning in dry conditions. But my standard sort of weaning target's about that 45% of standard reference weight. In some of these tough seasons, we don't always get to those standard weaning weights. And I'll talk about that in a sec, how we can overcome mortality with those animals. The next one I've got there is your joining target. So a standard joining target is 80% of standard reference weight or more. So when we look at ewe lamb joinings, we target around that 80%, sometimes slightly lower. And when you look at a hogget joining, I'd want them to be at least 80% of standard reference weight. So you can see there, no matter when you're joining, we're looking at that sort of 48 kilos for a 60 kilo ewe, or 52 kilos for a hogget joining if the standard reference weight's 70 kilos. So in the table below, I've given you a few growth rate targets a day. So you can see there with a 70 kilo standard reference weight lamb, so that's the mothers, the 70 kilo standard reference weight. When you look at a ewe lamb, for a hogget joining. So we're not going to join them as a lamb. We're just going to wait till they're a standard hogget, standard joining. We want them to grow at least that 265 grams per day, and that'll help us hit that 31.5 kilos at weaning. So that's the growth rate we're targeting from birth to weaning. And then from weaning to that standard hogget joining, we actually only need them to grow at 50 grams a day as a minimum, and that'll get us through to that 52 kilos. So ideally, that is a minimum. We want them to be over that, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides' time. But, I guess we're looking now at different classes of animals. So if we've had this weather lamb bought out of this 70 kilo ewe, I'm targeting them to grow more like sort of 300 grams a day from birth through to weaning. So we're aiming for a slightly heavier weaning weight. And it's because we're trying to get them finished and off the place as quick as possible. So looking at finishing those lambs, I'd then be targeting more like 300 grams per day on average for sort of a mob of merinos post-weaning as an average. So you're always going to have a little bit of a tail, but that would be my average across the mob. So I guess the point of this slide is for you guys to set some targets. And then, I love having sort of dates in the calendar every 6 or 8 weeks that you actually weigh your ewe lambs or weigh your weather lambs. And especially once feed starts to dry out, and just see what growth rates you're actually achieving. So when we look at this 50 grams per head per day growth rate target, so this graph's come out of trial work done, and it was used in the Winning with Weaners program. And it basically shows that under that 50 grams per head per day, once you've weaned lambs, ewe lambs or weather lambs, if you're growing slower than 50 grams per head per day after that point, you've got a very high risk of high weaner mortality. So you can see there under that 50 grams per day, we're up over 10% mortality, even if we've weaned the animals at that 45% of standard reference weight. So, my target generally is higher than that 50 grams, especially sort of post-weaning as we get into that first summer. So I'd be generally targeting, at least 100 grams, especially with ewe lambs. So as I said, with weather lambs, I'm going to be pushing them quicker than that. But with ewe lambs, I'd want them 50 to 100 grams, definitely not any of them going below that minimum of 50 grams. So I guess you want your tail can be at 50 grams, but that you want the average of the mob to be a bit higher than that. So, as you can see there, if you get them to 100 grams per day, your mortality is significantly lower than if they're growing 50 grams per head per day post-weaning. So we'll talk about some of the nutrition and how we can make sure they are growing quicker to avoid that weaner mortality, especially when we're looking at sort of breeder replacements that we have to carry over summer. So I didn't touch on, sorry, and it is in those weaning webinars, but if you're weaning lighter than your 45% standard reference weight, you can actually reduce the risk of weaner mortality by pushing the growth rates even quicker. So, often if they're only at 35 or 40% of standard reference weight at weaning, I'll push them a little bit harder for sort of 4 to 6 weeks just to get them out of that sort of light mortality risk, and then we push their growth rates on, and then you can slow them back to that sort of 50 to 100 grams average after that. But as I touched on as well, when we look at weaning time and growth rate targets, I think there needs to be a really good focus this year on ewe recovery as well. So what we saw sort of last year is, there was a lot of early weaning. So in a lot of cases, we did have that long recovery time that's shown in the top part of that graph. So, in a standard setup where you're weaning 14 weeks after the start of lambing, your ewes have got a recovery of 17 weeks. If you do delay that weaning, you can see the bottom example, we've delayed it to 20 weeks. You already cut that recovery time back to 11 weeks. So, when we saw ewes coming into joining, it really was just a lack of spring and the lack of feed last year. And, it being pretty tricky to keep supplementary feeding in the amounts required, we saw a lot of ewes that probably didn't hit condition score targets or have long enough recovery time prior to joining. And that had a real impact on the conception into this sort of year's lambing. So, it's a mistake, I guess, I'm pretty keen not to see repeated. And this graph looks a bit complicated, but it basically just shows it's come from all the lifetime wool data for merino ewes. So if you look at the black line in the middle there, I think you'll be able to see my cursor. That's the number of lambs per 100 ewes related to the condition score of the ewe at joining. So you can see at 3 score average, we're likely to get around 120% or 120 lambs per 100 ewes at scanning. Where if we can join at score 4, we're likely to get more like that 140% of conception. So it's 20 extra lambs per 100 ewes they're likely to conceive. And you can see with these trends, basically as the ewes get in higher condition score into conception, you've got singles dropping off, twin lambs increasing, and the dry percent going down. So, this was really apparent in a lot of flocks that were just a little bit behind the 8 ball at joining. So I guess I'm talking about young animal growth today, but these slides are just to not forget about the ewes when we're prioritising good feed paddock. We still want that good recovery and that target of, close to 4 score ready for joining to keep our results going well for sort of 2026 lambing. So, when we talk about hitting growth targets, Colin's going to cover off really well on some of the health things, because I guess for me, when I predominantly do nutrition program, you can't forget about the health, because there are plenty of things that are going to have an impact on growth rate, but he'll cover those shortly. So when we look at hitting growth targets, it's critical, and this is very dependent on the weight of a lamb, but when I look at, say, a 30 kilo weaned lamb, you're wanting that protein at around or slightly over 15%. We're wanting energy of the feed they're consuming, whether it's pasture or a mix, supplementary feed mix. We want that over that 10 megajoules per kilo dry matter. And we've also got a fibre requirement for most ruminants, which is about 30%. So, we can be lower than 30% for short periods of time, but when we're looking at longer term feeding of breeder replacements and things, I like that fibre level to be around 30%. So if your weaners are lighter, the protein requirement goes up. So, we can look at sort of 16 to 17% even, depending on how light those sort of weaners are. So you can get sort of more specific advice if you are doing some of those really early weaning programs. So, what we see with our protein, energy, fibre, in this example, which is also from the Winning with Weaners course, you can see in this bottom left-hand corner, so on the scale here, we've got the energy of the ration, and it's critical we sort of get that energy and protein in balance. So you can see on the left-hand axis, a lot of our grain feeds at the moment are really high in protein, so they're going to be a lot more than 15 at the moment, and energy might still only be around that 11 to 12. But yeah, you see if we're looking at balanced sort of rations, you can see this green line here, they're only going to maintain, so they're not actually going to put on growth rate. And you can see at the bottom end here, it really is that protein that's limiting growth rate. So for a young animal that's trying to lay down muscle, there's just insufficient protein at the bottom end for them to put on any growth. And you can see here the yellow line, if we're targeting that 150 grams per day, we're needing, say, 14% protein here and at least 12 megajoules of energy. If we've got higher protein, we're also needing higher energy to balance it out. So it shows, I guess, depending on the feed type, we need to look at whether it's protein, energy, or fibre that's likely restricting some of our growth rates, or in some ways it can even be minerals. So, the other thing I see is just pure pasture availability. So obviously this was more, I guess more of a widespread issue last year. And there's still many places in South Australia that, due to a bit of another late break and a lack of spring, the pasture height just hasn't been there. So I guess when we look at pasture weaner targets or post-weaning growth, we're wanting to wean those lambs and grow them out on ideally 12 to 1,500 kilos dry matter per hectare. So, we talk that on a dense pasture. When we've got cereals, because they've got so much space between the rows, you'll have similar height if there's only 600 to 700 kilos of dry matter per hectare of cereal. So as far as them being able to access plenty of pasture due to height, you can get away with sort of that 600 to 700 kilos dry matter per hectare of cereal. The picture I've got there is probably only 200 to 300 kilos of dry matter per hectare of cereal. So the problem is with those pastures that aren't quite there is they're unlikely to hit their protein and energy targets in a day. So you may need some extra supplement or lower stocking rates until those pastures can kind of catch up and get to the height you need them to be. And ideally, in pastures that we use for weaners, we'd like sort of 20% legume. And that's just because the extra digestibility of the legume pasture or the legume component of the pasture means they can consume more sort of pasture in a day. So I'll just summarize before handing over to Colin. So I guess for me, the most important things are to set those weight gain targets. So, looking at that minimum of, I'd look more at that minimum of 100 grams for your breeder replacements a day and, 250 to 350 grams, depending on genetics, in your finishing lambs. And then once you've set those growth rate targets, make sure you put those time points in your diary and just monitor them intermittently and make sure the mob is actually moving forward. Because if they're not, you can start looking at nutritional health. Ewe recovery. So I've just really seen the impact of that lack of ewe recovery or the lack of nutrition given to ewes due to the poor spring. So I think it's just something we really need to focus on by weaning on time, but also looking that those ewes are getting enough nutrition to get back to condition score targets before joining again ready for 26. And then really looking at what the animals need for growth. So whether it's protein lacking, energy, minerals, looking at what your missing link is that's stopping you getting that performance out of those growing lambs post-weaning. Thank you. I'll hand back to you, Jodie.
Thanks, Deb. Great intro. Cole, do you want to share your screen?
Okay. Oh, thank you very much, Jodie, and well done, Deb, on covering this subject very succinctly. And I'll follow on mainly from an animal health perspective and minimise the overlap, I guess, with what Deb has just said. So talking about weaner management, the 6 topics I was focused on, I guess, was vaccination. We'll cover off the vaccination, worm control. I won't talk about monitoring growth rates, as Deb has certainly covered that very adequately, but needless to say, it's so critical to getting weaners through the first year. Following on by trace elements and vitamins, a bit about grass seed management, and finish up on some of the common diseases we encounter. So firstly, on the vaccination program, so primarily we're focused on dealing with enterotoxemia or pulpy kidney and tetanus. And so the photo up here in the top right is a classic photo of an animal that's died from enterotoxemia. Because it's a very, they actually are quite decomposing virtually inside before they die. They get a lot of hemorrhage from their lungs, and they have quite a panicked death, and so they get all that froth at the mouth, and often it's blood tinged because of the hemorrhaging as well. But so that's one of the 6 diseases that we aim to vaccinate against. Sometimes you can use 3 in 1, probably in South Australia quite effectively, but generally it's recommended the Glandvax 6 in 1. So the boost, the system is that normally if there's antibodies passed over from the ewe, if they were vaccinated prior to birth, you get our first 6 weeks coverage. Then you give a booster at should I say a primer at marking, which lasts for about 2 or 3 months. And then we give a second dose, the booster, at weaning, which will then last hopefully for the next 12 months. But sometimes if those lambs are put into adverse situations where they're actually, for example, on a high protein diet, a loose from pasture, or a medic or a clover that's far more than the 20% that Deb mentioned, sometimes they can be quite risky, and so it pays to give another booster, perhaps after 3 months or 6 months, to ensure that they're adequately covered. And when we say adequately covered, even if you've got the best vaccination program going going around, you're still probably going to have 20% of animals that will be exposed. So if you're giving them a high risk pasture or environment, they can still can have a few deaths from it. A couple other pointers here. Only use 1/4-inch needles and preferably 18 gauge so that you can get the mil or so of vaccine in quickly. And we always put it under the skin, so tent up the skin behind the ear, behind and below the ear. And the idea of a 1/4-inch needle is it just goes subcutaneous, in other words, just through the skin, and it's not going deeper into the muscle. And one of the risks that we've seen, and especially with the good air vaccine, is that some people are using longer needles and it goes right into the spine and causes an abscess. And so 2 or 3 weeks later, those animals will be doing cartwheels and will be need to be euthanized. So yeah, definitely only use a 1/4-inch needle and just push it through the skin. And we're using it up around the head region because that's an area that's of little value when it comes to slaughter. So we don't want to go jabbing into muscles that are of higher value, especially given the value of the lambs currently. Okay, so moving on to worms. So weaners, they don't have a complete immunity by the time they're weaned, and in fact, not up until about 9 months when they start to acquire some of their own immunity. They're born with an innate immunity, but the acquired immunity probably gives them much better protection against worms. So because of that susceptibility, we really do need to look after them. And probably if you only give a sheep 1 drench a year, it should be at weaning. The idea is that most of the time through a sheep's life, we will be monitoring the worm egg counts, and depending on their age as to how often. But weaners, for example, would ideally be doing it every 6 weeks, just checking, because the life cycle of a worm is only about 3 weeks, and so they can quickly build up a burden if you are not keeping your finger on the pulse. In the case of adult sheep, we may be checking them more like 2 or 3 monthly, but if it's, for example, pregnant ewes, they're under a stress, and so they should be checked probably every 2 months as well. We really only drench if necessary, because the more drenches you give sheep, the more you encourage resistance to those drenches. So that's why we recommend worm egg counts. Worm egg counts around about $30 or $40 is far cheaper than lining all your sheep up with an expensive drench. Another good practice too is also to prepare paddocks with a low worm risk. So for animals that are most susceptible to worms, such as lambs and late pregnant ewes, ideally they're in paddocks that have a low worm risk or a low worm density in there. And especially if you're weaning lambs, you want to be putting them into a paddock that hasn't been grazed by other wormy sheep in the last 4 to 6 months. We prefer to use short-acting triple-active drenches, and the reason being is that they're in and out of the system within 24 hours, so there's very little chance for worms to develop a resistance to the chemical actives in those drenches. And when we say triple, that means there's 3 different chemicals in there that all have a worm-killing advantage. The other idea here is to check 10 days later, do another worm egg count, and just see that the worm levels are back to 0, indicating that the drench did work. Another strategy for reducing the risk of resistance is with adult sheep to leave about 20% of the healthy ones undrenched. So the other ones that are big and in condition score 3+. And the idea there is that they will carry a few worms into the next paddock when they're moved on, but won't be affecting their health. And those worm larvae are obviously not exposed to chemical because the sheep haven't been drenched. So that provides a bit of a chemical susceptible worm load in the next paddock, which is a good thing for encouraging a bit of immunity and reduces worm resistance. The other final point here is just using Australian sheep breeding values to select worm-resistant rams. So if you do have a recurrent worm issue in your area, by using rams that actually have a high worm resistance, in other words, they have an ability to suppress worm populations in their gut, you can actually reduce your worm burden on your property by 50% over a few years with using these worms. There's a lot more detail about worms on WormBoss. In fact, as much information as you could ever care to read. Very well set up. And similarly, the risk of fly strike and lice, for example, is also on that similar worm site, similar site being Paraboss. So well worth a read if you want to find out more information. This busy looking slide is just talking about the trace elements and vitamins, and just advising here that you really want to know what your risk is, and every paddock can be different, never alone every property, so it's very hard to extrapolate. So Deb covered off on the energy and the protein in terms of the likelihood of a risk. Energy can be lacking at any time of the year, protein more so in your dry summer, autumn months, and typically result in the poor growth that Deb described. The lighter colours here indicate that there may be a risk of deficiency, a low risk, and then the darker colour indicates a much higher risks. So, for example, vitamin A, we normally find that in green feed, but it can be quite lacking in green feed, and it may also be lacking in summer, more typically in summer, I guess, with the lack of green feed available. And vitamin A is really important for general immunity, but particularly for fertility, skin health, and also does appear to have a bearing on the incidence of pink eye. Vitamin D, of course, is acquired through sunlight, and so through the winter-spring period, vitamin D can be quite lacking, and it's generally considered that most of southern Australia is actually lacking in vitamin D through wintertime. But it can also be limiting in the summer months as well. And if you're not having enough vitamin D in the system, same as for humans, you're more predisposed to osteoporosis and fragile bones, ill thrift, and rickets. So vitamin D is pretty important. The other one is vitamin E. Now, vitamin E is generally provided by green feed, but will be lacking if they haven't had a green feed in the system for 2 or 3 months, similar to vitamin A. So vitamin A and E, if you've got a lack of a green feed for 2 or 3 months, they will become a problem. And so once again, vitamin E is a bit like vitamin selenium. It predisposes to white muscle disease and lower immunity. So it is recommended that you give vitamin A, D, and E to lambs, probably at lamb marking and again at weaning. And it may also be an advantage to include it in some mineral mixes or as an oral drench during the latter stages of the first year of the lamb's life.
Cole, I might just interrupt you there. Questions come through. What's white muscle disease?
Oh, sorry. Yes. So white muscle disease, I guess it's a descriptive condition. White muscle disease is actually, if you do a post-mortem on animals that are suffering vitamin E deficiency or selenium, you'll find pale streaks in the heart, in the muscle, and particularly the muscles that are used the most. So, for example, the heart, some of the leg muscles, but yeah, you'll just find this white pale streaks, which is just indicating you've had oxidative damage to that muscle, and so it's no longer functional. And so, given enough damage through oxidative processes, those animals will die. They certainly will be very ill thrifty, and they look very hunched up and crawl around a bit like a crab. So it's very, very distinctive appearance. So with the trace elements, copper, cobalt, and selenium are the ones we mainly deal with. You may also deal with iodine and manganese and zinc, but they're less common. And with these, they all tend to be limiting in the green time of the year when the plant root system is not fully developed. So it's not taking up much trace element from the soil. And as a result of that, the plants are deficient, and the animals' reserves, as they run out, they might, for example, sheep can only hold on to cobalt for a week. They can hold on to copper for a couple of months and hold on to selenium for a couple of months. But as those sources are exhausted, you'll run into deficiency in that late winter spring period. Whereas in the summer autumn period, animals that tend to be eating more soil, and so they're actually eating more copper, cobalt, and selenium direct rather than relying on getting it through the plant. But they all have an impact have similar impacts. They can all cause diarrhea. They all cause poor growth. They may cause anemia, lethargy, especially cobalt. It's an appetite stimulant. So without cobalt, the animals don't perform very well at all. And yeah, as I said before, selenium also produces this muscle damage as well. The one other here that with the cobalt, with copper, that's involved in the spinal cord formation. So if they have a copper deficiency during pregnancy, the lambs may be born with ataxia, and so sway back, as it's commonly called, where they can't sort of walk a straight line. Okay, now just dealing with finishing up on some of the common diseases that you may encounter. So arthritis, this is generally associated with perhaps poor hygiene, where infection has got in through the navel at birth, or otherwise through poor antisepsis at lamb marking. So any cuts or abrasions is an opportunity for an infection to get in, and depending on which bacteria or virus gets in as to what the problem is. And so, for example, this little photo of this little lamb here, hunched up, looking very ordinary. Looks like it might also have a bit of derma as well. This is actually a case of erysipelas. So that actually can be treated by vaccinating these animals, vaccinating their mothers, and also perhaps the lambs at marking, to avoid that infection. And then they don't end up with the arthritis. But there are half a dozen other bugs which cause arthritis, which can't be vaccinated against. So if you find that you're getting a lot of animals with arthritis, certainly focus on the hygiene at lamb marking, and perhaps use Erivac vaccine against erysipelas. But if that's not solving the problem, well, yeah, you might have to resort to antibiotics. But antibiotics are really only useful at the very early stages of arthritis. Once they've got knobbly knees or knobbly joints and hunched up like this one, they're not going to recover. Pink eye, that seems to be a problem year in, year out, and it can occur in summer and winter. In summer, we normally associate it with dust and flies. In winter, we probably associate more with vitamin A deficiency. And so when it gets big, red and nasty like this, where you've got a total opacity of the eyeball, the risk is that the animal will poke their eye out with a stick or do some other injury like that. Now, 80% of animals do self-cure with pink eye, but when it gets to that stage, you really would like to put an eye patch over it, just glue a bit of old jeans over it. Ideally, you would put a bit of antibiotic in there as well. So you can buy these tubes of pink eye ointment, which are little, you only have to put about a fifth of a dose, a fifth of a barrel in each eye, and it lasts for 48 hours, so you only treat them once. I don't really advocate the pressure packs because they only last for about an 8-hour period, and you can appreciate animals don't resent them as anyone would with a pressure pack in your eyeball. So these pink eye treatments of tubes are far better idea. Some people also, you can use a long-acting terramycin, oxytetracycline, or alleamycin. That's also quite effective as an intramuscular injection as opposed to intraocular. Now, pneumonia, increasingly more common, and we're finding that it generally can be acquired at birth. Effectively, the ewe has the organisms in their nasal passages, and as they tend to the lamb becomes infected, and it's pretty hard to fight off because they don't actually have the immunity at that point in time. So this is a lung of a lamb post-mortem, where we see normal lung tissue here in this nicely pink inflated tissue, but the edges here and the at the head end is all consolidated pneumonia material. And so invariably you tend to find the pneumonia at the head end of the lung. And we can see here that when I've peeled the rib cage back, that the lung here was stuck to the rib cage as well. So that's called pleurisy when it gets to that stage, quite an advanced chronic pneumonia. And so, yeah, this is primarily caused initially by a mycoplasma infection, and then they may acquire other bacteria which actually cause the death. But Roseworthy are working on a vaccine against mycoplasma, so hopefully we can reduce the incidence of this. So we do see a lot of it in feedlots, a lot of it across the state in all breeds, and seems to be an increasingly big problem. It can be treated with antibiotics successfully if you get it too early enough, but sometimes once it's an advanced infection, there's no recovery. And the last one here I'll cover off is a grab bag, so scours in general. So coccidiosis, Salmonella, Yersinia, E. coli, these are all organisms which can be commonly present in the gut, but not causing a problem because the animal's got good immunity, it's well fed, and so they're suppressed. But when these animals become stressed, or if they've got trace element deficiencies, as we just described, or vitamin deficiencies, these organisms can start to multiply and cause problems. And invariably they'll cause like a dysenteric or a dysentery diarrhea. In the case of Salmonella and coccidiosis, you'll see blood in it as well, and that may make it look black because it's digested blood. And so these conditions are generally predisposed by stress, cold weather, and nutritional imbalances. You can also, obviously, the most common cause of scares, such as these, are going to be worms. And so you really want to rule out worms as the first issues. If they're not responding to a worm drench, or the egg count indicates they don't have a worm problem, well, then you look to do some of these other treatments. And there are a number of antibiotics that we can use to treat all these conditions. Okay, so I guess the summary of all this is that monitoring is the key. So you need to check your vitamin and mineral status, probably more so mineral status, in that late winter period when the supplies in the animal from the autumn have sort of been exhausted. And with worm egg counts, we like to do a worm egg count every probably 6 weeks, especially through those pre-weaning, post-weaning stages, to see that worms aren't getting on top of their weaners, because the adults they have the immunity to fight off a worm infestation, but the younger sheep, the hoggets and younger, don't. And so that's why we need to monitor them quite frequently. Monitoring the lamb growth weights to ensure that we're encouraging optimum survival, as Deb advised. And the last one here I really haven't dealt with much at all is the grass seeds. Just that we need to be proactive in dealing with grass seeds. There's some areas of the state where abattoirs won't accept the lambs after about September, October, because the grass seeds, for example, Vulpia, perhaps not so much barley grass, but they get in through the skin and damage the hide, and the lambs end up being condemned. So having a good grass seed control, or making sure that you only put your lambs in paddocks that don't have a grass seed problem, is fundamental. Okay, I'd like to finish up there. Thanks, Jody.
Thanks, Cole. That's fantastic. And we will delve into the questions that people submitted prior to the webinar. So what I've done with the questions that came in is I've themed them, and I'll address those to our two great panelists tonight. So we've got both a nutritionist and a veterinarian online, so great opportunity to get your questions answered. So first question, and Deb, I'm going to direct this one to you. So maiden ewes, and the producers asked, why am I seeing oversized and undersized lambs in the same mob?
Thanks, Jody. So yeah, this is a bit of a tricky one to answer without having history of the mob, but I'll give some generic sort of examples of why this might be happening. So one of them is probably just unscanned mobs, so running twins, triplets and singles in together. So, often if we're not treating animals differently when they've got different numbers of lambs, you imagine, a large single, that nutrition that's gone into the ewe will be split over 2 lambs if they're twins, or 3 if it's triplets. So we're likely then to get a massive difference in sort of lamb birth weight based on how many lambs that ewe had inside. So, ideally we manage them as completely different animals, and that gives us the best chance of having high birth weights and high survival. The other thing I've seen, probably this year, sort of following along with what I said with the lack of spring and lack of ewe recovery, I've seen a lot of ewes just come into joining in very different condition scores, and it has sort of carried through. So I'd have some mobs where we have managed twins separately, but we might have a range of sort of 1 condition score, which is a lot greater than I'd like. So if we've got sort of 275 through to 375, my target for twins is 3.5. So that'll give us the best opportunity of decent lamb size to get some survival, where if you're lambing twins in 275, you're likely to see some very small lambs. So it could be that you've got a variation in condition score in that mob. And the last thing is genetics. So there is a big difference in genetics of birth weight. So you can get ASBVs that'll indicate that on rams, and you can do a flock profile on your ewes. So if you've got a range of different genetics in your mob, that could be another possible reason. That's the main 3 I'd sort of suggest at this stage.
Great, thanks. The other one, I would encourage you to catch up with myself at some upcoming field days. We've got some scales that we make available to producers so you can weigh your lambs in the paddock. Next one, right. Colin, I'm going to direct this one to you. How to work out the number of ewes per paddock for lambing?
Okay, I'd like to put up an illustration for that. Yes, thank you. So this is a very, I think, a very succinct illustration of why we recommend certain mob sizes for different paddocks. And the reason being is that, for a start, that ewes don't tend to lamb down evenly across a paddock. They tend to lamb down more in concentrated areas like stock camps. So it's actually a stocking density issue more than a stocking rate issue. If we see this work that was done some time ago, where we're looking at the number of lambs born per day and the survival percentage. So with singles, if you've only got a low number of lambs being born each day, for example, 0 to 16, the survival rate is next to 100%. If you've got a medium density lambing where you've got 17 to 32 lambs a day, you're up around 94%. And if you've got a high density lambing, 33 to 48%, you've still got a pretty good lambing survival rate at 95%. Whereas if we do the sums and say, okay, if we have the ewes and rams in good condition, score 3, and fighting fit, when in the first cycle, they should get about 2/3 of the ewes pregnant. So 66% of the lambs should be born in the first cycle, the first 17 days. If you have 200 twin ewes in a mob of sheep, they will roughly be lambing at about 8 will be lambing a day, which means 16 lambs a day. So if we look over here, that's a low density lambing, 0 to 16. And so we can still get that high, quite good survival rate for twins, around about 83%. Whereas if we had 500 twin bearing ewes in a paddock, they would be lambing down about 19 lambings a day, or 38 lambs. So we see that comes into this high density lambing range where you get a lot of mismothering, and so hence you get this much lower survival rate. So it just highlights that ideally you'd like to have less than 200 twin bearing ewes in a mob in a paddock, so that you're just restricting the number of lambs born each day and restricting the number of the amount of mismothering. In the case of single bearing ewes, you can have 250 or 300, but and that really just comes probably back to how much feed on offer in the paddock as well. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Cole. And next question, one for you, Deb. How long do I have to withhold stock from a paddock sprayed with liquid urea mixed at 20? This example from the producer is at 25 kilograms per hectare.
Yeah, so it's probably just important just to look at product label advice depending on what you're actually using as far as fert goes. But the standard for liquid urea is 21 days on the label. And yeah, realistically, generally, I'd always allow at least 14 days for any urea application. And it's just because that risk of sort of nitrates building up in leaf and giving you nitrate poisoning. So over that sort of 21 days, it's been utilised in the plant and it becomes a lot safer for you to graze.
Next questions, some questions on weaning. First one, we're going to go back to you again, Deb. If we wean our lambs earlier than normal, is there anything we can do to help survival rates?
Yeah, and I'll cover this briefly, but I encourage you to listen back to that weaning webinar because there is a fair focus on early weaning, the one we did in 25 and also in 2024, and that will give you really good information around weaning. But a brief sort of answer. So as I said, if you're under that 45% of standard reference weight, your weaning weights, it's really critical to have high growth rates post-weaning. So, if we have standard growth rates post-weaning and we're weaning at under 45%, you've got quite a high risk of mortality. But if you wean light weaners and have them on appropriate nutrition and make sure you've got no imbalances and high growth rates, you can actually have very high survival rates. So I feel like we've got relatively good at that over the last couple of dry years. There's a few other critical things like just imprint feeding. So, if you're going to put the lambs on feeders post-weaning, make sure they've been introduced with their mum. Same if you're going to trail feed them. Because the biggest issue I have is these light weaners that don't go straight onto the new feed source or the new feed out method. And that week or so until they get used to it is really critical as far as keeping them moving. And then, as I said, when they're lighter, if you are going under that 30 kilos, your protein requirement goes up substantially. So it's just important that you hit the protein energy targets for those lighter weaners as well. That's the three main things. But as I said, there's some really good information that we've put together over the last couple of months about early weaning that you can revisit on the AWI Extension SA website.
Thanks, Deb. Yep. And if you can't find those webinars, flick me a message. You would have had my email address when it would come back to you when you registered, and I'll flick you the links to those webinars if you can't find them. Next one to you, Cole. What is best practice weaning onto green feed, especially when it's not when it's now fast growing?
Yes, it's a good question, and probably it's a difficult one in this particular year because of the most of the fibre has been probably used up in the country, or certainly in South Australia anyway. And so the idea is when we put weaners onto any sudden change in diet, whether it's going from dry feed to grain or hay to grain, or from essentially a confinement feeding or containment feeding and then put out on a green feed, that sudden change in feed intake upsets the balance of microbial activity in the rumen. And so the rumen takes some time to adjust to that change of feed source. In the case of green feed, it's obviously it can be quite a high octane feed in that it can be high energy and high protein and readily digestible, which is somewhat different to the dry feed that they normally may be accustomed to. And so we really need to introduce them into a lush green feed or fast-growing green feed on a part-time basis, so slowly introduce it to over a number of days. Ideally, you'd have them filled up on hay or some other good fibre source before they went into the green feed initially, so they don't get too big a gutful, because that's a classic situation where you do get deaths from enterotoxemia. Or in the case of some of the legumes, for example, clovers and lucins, that's also when you can get a red gut when they get a twisted bowel. So the idea of introducing into any lush, fast-growing feed, which invariably is going to be high in energy and protein, is to just do it steadily. Otherwise, too much of a good thing can be quite catastrophic. And even if they have been vaccinated, the risks remain that they can die from enterotoxemia. So yeah, it's a case of if you can access any fibre, that's the time to use it.
Fantastic. Some questions about post-weaning. So this one, we've lost what appears to be perfectly healthy ewes post-weaning. It seems that we've lost more post-weaning than when lambing. Any thoughts? And I might direct that one to you, Cole.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I just wonder whether if it was a case of early weaning, I can understand in that the ewes may still have a significant amount of a milk supply, and like all mammalian species, if you cut off the milk requirement suddenly, that can cause a bit of a discomfort and predispose to infections. So, for example, when they haven't been lactating, there's the opportunity for organisms to get back up the teat canal, and if they've got effectively a supply of milk that's not being utilised, it provides a nice rich bed for microbes to multiply. So with deaths post weaning, I'd be concerned that it is something probably akin to enterotoxemia, but it could be a number of other organisms which may be causing mastitis as well, or causing mastitis, which is leading on to a blood poisoning. And the most common one for that would be E. coli. Now, E. coli is normally present in dung, and so if you're getting contamination of the udder, for example, from dung, then it might be circumstantial in terms of the ewes might be having a bit of a scour post weaning, and they're getting contamination on the teats and getting a E. coli infection, which is effectively called black mastitis. So that'd be my suspicion there, is that it's either essentially associated with the sudden cut off in the milk supply, and these animals are acquiring an infection perhaps through the teats, or otherwise another possibility would be that the ewes are a bit run down at the end of by the time they get to weaning, especially in the year we've had, because we've had such a poor feed year that perhaps their immunity is way down, and the stress has just got too much for them. Even though that now the lamb's been taken off, well, I suppose that is still a stress for them, and so it might be associated with that lowered immunity given the season we've had.
Perfect segue to the next one, which you may have answered part of it here about why are ewes getting mastitis post-weaning, and I guess that follow on to that, how to prevent stop that happening.
Yeah, that's mastitis is a really difficult one, and I mean, whether they get mastitis soon after birth or whether at any stage during the lactational phase is very problematic in that, once again, it's an infection getting up through the teat canal primarily. Now, whether it's through dust or whether it's through moisture or whether it's through just the actual lambs sucking on the teats and transferring infection that way. Certainly, for example, you can get scabby mouth being spread by lambs sucking on teats, and the scabby mouth infection causes the teat canals to be damaged, and so the ewes end up getting mastitis and potentially dying from it. So I have seen that on several occasions. So ewes getting mastitis post weaning, I would be just associating that with probably a combination of their lowered immune status and the fact that there's still an opportunity for infections to get into teat canals, even though they have now ceased to suckle, but they're probably still dribbling a bit of milk for a few days post weaning. So that would be an opportunity for infection to get in. It's just acting like a wick, the same as the umbilical cord does at birth. A wet wick provides an ideal opportunity for infection to get in, and if you get a nasty one such as E. coli, that can cause a blood poisoning and death within 24 hours.
Thank you.
Oh, and sorry, so yeah, probably in terms of prevention, look, I can't really come with any good ideas there. It does tend to be, or mastitis tends to be a bigger issue in your heavier milking breeds. So, for example, Poll Dorsets are quite prone to it, but I've seen it often enough in merinos. And really, the trouble is you don't often pick up on it until it's too late. So it's antibiotics can cure it, but look, it's probably one of those diseases that we really haven't come up with any good answers yet.
Thank you. Another research project there for you, Cole.
Yeah.
And next questions relate to livestock nutrition. Deb, I might direct the first one to you. What additional supplements are recommended to prepare and or while in containment?
Yep, thank you. So I was assuming that meant sort of mineral supplements on top of your feed supplementation, which obviously is targeted to hit protein energy requirements at those certain stages of pregnancy. But yeah, when we look at mineral supplementation, I guess in a dry year that we've had, a lot of the supplements are hay and grains, which are all very calcium deficient. So my first thing is with macro minerals, just ensuring you've got enough calcium, and also magnesium demands lift during late pregnancy. Colin covered microminerals well. Really, it does depend on the micromineral deficiencies in the feed you're feeding in containment, whether you need to focus too much on those. And then I guess, as Colin said with vitamins earlier, there was a lot of sort of vitamin deficiencies around this year, and it's just because we had such a long period of time where stock didn't have access to green feed. So that A&E, was relatively critical in containment this year, just because it wasn't in the green feed, or they hadn't been on green feed for sort of more than 3 months in most cases. So, an AD&E injection, and then, generally I'd just recommend high quality loose licks, which will often have your microminerals and vitamins and your macrominerals required for pregnant ewes.
Thank you. Next one, follows on from that, Deb, I'll put this one to you. What's the best supplements, trace elements to give weaned lambs on pastures?
Yeah, so this really depends on pasture types, but as Colin said with his good chart on the micromineral side, generally lush growing pastures with sort of not that well-established root systems are likely to have some deficiencies in microminerals. So, often it is selenium, cobalt, sometimes copper, and it can vary a lot sort of by region and also pasture type. But yeah, it's worth sort of looking at, either with plant tissue testing, soil testing, or blood testing, working out what your deficiencies might be. And then there's some other sort of critical minerals, I guess, when we look at macro minerals, as far as like grazing cereals are quite often deficient in magnesium and calcium, so they can be relatively critical. So there's been a lot of sort of trials done on growing lambs and adding magnesium when grazing cereals, and it can significantly lift growth rate. So it could be good to put out the magnesium and balance with calcium when you're grazing deficient cereals, just to actually get those growth rates a bit higher, especially with the current sort of kilos of lamb price that we're seeing at the moment too.
Thanks, Deb. A question that's come in, I might pose this one to you, Cole. How do you test for vitamin and mineral deficiencies?
Deb just touched on it in that you can actually, one comprehensive way, I suppose, is to look at plant tissue analysis. So if you can sample the paddock they're eating in and have a full mineral analysis done on it, you can look at about 15 different minerals, and that can give you quite a good idea of essentially what their diet is, and comparing it to ideal results, you can establish that they might be lacking in one or more minerals. The trouble is a lot of the minerals interact in that the excess of one mineral will make another one less available. So it does require a bit of a knowledge of how the interactions occur. But so for about $80, you can get a plant tissue test done, and it takes probably about a week, and you can actually have a pretty good idea of what their diet is providing. But a more reliable system is to take a blood sample, and probably from this time on, now that we're into August, the blood test is as good as a liver test. Normally earlier in the year we might do a liver test, a liver biopsy, just take a bit of liver, which you can do quite relatively easily out of a healthy animal and not cause any death. And you only need to sample about 7 animals. In the case of blood samples, I'd normally take about 10 blood samples, so 5 from animals that look to be in a perhaps above average condition and 5 that are in below average condition. And you can either bulk those together, so you just end up with 2 results. But ideally, you probably look at the 10 samples individually, but it does cost about $500 or $600 in laboratory fees. But you can then look at copper, cobalt, selenium, and zinc, for example, if they're the ones you're concerned about. And so, yeah, it's not a cheap exercise, depending on how you go about it. Whereas, that's why sometimes I like to do a plant tissue analysis if they're on a fairly straightforward diet. That gives you a pretty good indication of what's going on. Otherwise, a blood test is going to give you more specific information. But the thing is, with a blood test, you're only going to be able to say, okay, well, these animals are copper deficiency or selenium deficiency, and recommend a treatment to the animal down the throat or injection or whatever. Whereas if you do a tissue analysis and say, okay, these animals are potentially lacking in calcium and copper and zinc and manganese or boron, you can actually apply a foliar application to the paddock to address their issues. So that way you're getting 2 bangs for your buck. You're probably going to get a better response out of the pasture, and the animals are going to get a more sufficiency. So it does depend a bit on the circumstances as to what nutrition they're on. But I do like doing both foliar, should I say, trace element testing with blood, but also with a plant tissue analysis as well.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Cole. Another one here for you, Deb. When grazing lambs on canola, what are some of the health and nutrition issues to watch out for?
Yeah, so there's a few things with canola, and probably relevant to most of the brassica species, really. So often when we've got these real lush brassica canola plants, the protein energy balance is just way out of whack. So the bit of background to that question, the producer said they'd mown out all of the grass first. So the the lambs had gone in and sort of eaten every bit of grass they could, and then eventually went on to the brassica, which is normally quite common. And when you look at the protein level of these brassicas, they can be sort of 25 to 28% protein at the stage we're seeing them at the moment. And if you remember back to my chart where you need that balance, they're really just craving extra energy to kind of balance out that protein, and also the fiber level can be really low in those plants too. So in an ideal world, we'd give either have them in a mixed pasture with a few more grasses and some more fibrous species, or we'd give a supplement of something quite fibrous with energy. So oats is one of my favorites, nearly impossible to get at the moment, but a small amount of oats can really help balance out those really hot pastures, or the medics and clovers and lucens Colin talked about before. Higher fiber pellets that have good energy without too much protein in addition, but also some fiber level can be useful. The other issues you can have is they're quite high in sulfur, and you can get sort of nitrate poisoning on them too. And as Colin said, with your mineral interactions, the high sulfur can actually sometimes induce copper deficiency. And another issue we can sort of get on these feeds is photosensitization, which is where we get the scaly ears and the redness and skin sort of coming off around the face. And, sometimes we also get acidosis associated with introducing to those really hot pastures. So, as Colin said earlier, it really is about introducing them to it if they can. So just introducing it over a period of time. But for me, it's also just putting out those fibrous and high energy feeds to help with that adjustment, and also to help balance that feed day to day as they're sort of consuming it, especially once all the grasses are gone.
So Deb, there's a question's come through in the chat that's probably a perfect segue that I'll put to you now. So the producer here is weaning lambs onto legume pasture that's been sprayed for grasses. So it's 100% vetch and medic. So that's pretty hot, as you were just describing.
Yep.
Introduction to that pasture type. How should they go about that? And then also sort of with barley feeding going forward, if you wanted to just talk to that.
Yeah. So because I'm sort of trying to have a read of that too, but because they've been in there with their mum, probably not as much of an issue as far as introduction. So that's perfect as far as, there's always those worm issues when we have ewes and lambs on a feed and then keep the lambs on there post-weaning. But in the absence of any worm burdens, it's a great scenario because it means they're not combining the stress of weaning with going onto a new feed type. So my preference would be really to keep some sort of cereal grain out on paddocks like this. So, good quality hay can work, but I sort of find we often on those hot pastures put out good quality hay. They'll have a bit of a nibble, but they probably don't ever have enough to really balance out that energy protein ratio. Because that vetch medic pasture will be similar to what I described with the brassicas. It'll be in that probably high 20s for protein. So basically when they're scouring and going backwards, they're just trying to get rid of excess protein, and they actually burn up some of their energy trying to process the protein. So growth rate goes down because they're trying to balance it out. So providing that small amount of cereal grain, oats are perfect because of the fiber level, but in the absence of that, barley is still going to be really useful because it's just going to help fix up that energy protein ratio. And then if you did have excess cereal hay, which you're pretty lucky if you've come this far through the season with a bit of good cereal hay left, but I probably would just put a bale of that out just to help their fiber craving on those hot pastures as well. The other one Colin sort of touched on those sort of hot pastures post-weaning, I'd really recommend a 3-in-1 just to protect you for pulpy kidney. Because often once you get to that 3-month mark, even though they've been on that feed type, because it's so hot, you start to get pulpy kidney associated deaths as well.
So Deb, if they haven't been exposed to that legume pasture with mum, would you do anything differently?
Yeah, so I mean, in an ideal world, as Colin touched on with the rumen microbes, you do need to allow time for them to adjust to that new feed. So, I think in an ideal world, we'd always move them in and out onto those pastures over sort of that 7 to 10 days. So especially if you've got sort of more of a native-y grassy pasture, or if you're adjusting them from cereals, I quite like to push them in and out from the paddock next door until they're adjusted to it and the rumen microbes have sort of become more used to that hotter pasture. But, you know, in the practicality, I guess the practical world where you're running out of feed in one paddock, a lot of people are time poor. Yeah, my next go-to is just to make sure you've got the feeder that the weaners have had access to so they know what it is, and the hay, just so they do have some method of watering down that high protein feed as they first go onto it. So I guess there's the perfect ideal scenario, versus, you know, what most people end up doing if they've got thousands of weaners they're trying to do in a short amount of time.
Great. And got another question that's on the same bent. I might put this one to you, Cole. How do you prevent sore feet when grazing on hot clover pastures, as we've just been talking about? We've got canola, we've got vetch and medic. Ewes have come off grazing crops fine and then got hot feet on lucerne and clover this month. Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a bit like founder in horses, actually, where you're getting the high protein diets. You get a lot of the nitrogen is actually causing inflammation, or it causes a release of antihistamines, which they go to the lower limbs and cause soreness. So yeah, in that circumstance, once again, trying to adjust the diet when they're on the that's right, the high lucerne or high nitrogen pastures, which is essentially any of the legumes, you can end up with these antihistamine responses. And so really trying to balance the pasture, the diet with either a bit more energy or some more fibre can reduce that. I would mention that I'd also be checking the feet to make sure they haven't got some other issues, such as the scald, ovine interdigital dermatitis, or worse still, a bit of foot rot. But yeah, I know what the person's referring to is that they do just get this. In effect, it's a founder, and you know, there is some indication that it may predispose to, say, for example, shelly hoof in sheep as well. So that is a problem with once again on being on something that's too high in protein.
Thank you. We will move on to the animal health questions that have been submitted. There's a few that have come through in the chat too, and I'll post those at the end of these. So the first one is, Cole, how to manage coccidiosis and acute pneumonia in young lambs?
Okay, yeah, well, I did actually cover that a bit in my introduction, but the yeah, so with coccidiosis, I do see that as primarily it's a stress-related condition. So coccidia, or the little parasites called Eimeria, they're normally present in the gut of most sheep, and they don't cause any problems. But when the animal's immune system is suppressed or immunocompromised, and that may be because it's had cold, wet, rainy weather, that it's lacking in copper, cobalt, selenium, or vitamin A or E, and so all those good antioxidants are not in the system in the right balance, and so it gives the opportunity for, whether it's coccidia or other worms, they suddenly start to multiply. And in the case of coccidia, they start multiplying through the gut wall and causing bleeding, and so you end up with this black scour. And really the only way to treat it is there's a number of drugs available. Well, actually, obviously, for a start, it can be prevented with coccidiostats. So, for example, in feedlot situations, often people use coccidiostats like lazellicid acid. There's a couple others, which do work quite effectively as a preventative. But if you're not in the custom of doing that, but you find you've got this black scars situation, and I certainly want to make sure I differentiate it from salmonella, for example. Salmonella is far more dangerous and also a zoonosis. In other words, it can be spread to humans as well. But so identifying that it is a coccidiosis, I would be just minimising the stress on those animals, putting them into a good sheltered paddock, away from any disturbances. And usually, if you only have to give them one shot of sulfadimidine, and they'll get over it, even though most drugs are meant to be given for a minimum of 3 days. In the case of sulfadimidine or tolfazirazil, which is another more expensive variety. There's about 3 or 4 different drugs can be used. Yeah, they'll get over it pretty quickly, but it does set them back, and so you can't expect them to suddenly bounce back to where they were before. In the case of pneumonia, Yeah, once again, as I said, we are trying to develop a vaccine against mycoplasma, which is I guess, the main precursor or the initial cause of pneumonia in young animals. But the trouble is the fact that the lambs can acquire the infection off their mother at birth virtually. It's very hard to break the cycle. So there are a lot of flocks now have found they've got pneumonia where they had never had it before, and I think that's just been spread around over time by sheep movements and the like. And then when you put lambs into a feedlot, for example, you get a much greater exposure there. It's a bit like all the kids going on a school trip. That's when they pick up all the infections, and so that mixing of animals from different backgrounds results in quite an explosion of pneumonia. The initial cause, the mycoplasma, sets up the initial damage to the lung, but it's then the secondary infections come in, Mannheimia and Pasteurella, which actually often cause the death because they eventually cause basically there's no functional tissue left in the lung, and the animals end up effectively dying or from a blood poisoning or asphyxiation. So they can be, if seen early enough, if you just see it when they're coughing. I mean, sometimes these animals will prolapse their rectum too because of the coughing. And if you catch them early enough, you can give them antibiotics and fix it. And once again, there's 2 or 3 different antibiotics that can be used. There's Draxin and oxytetracycline can be quite effective, but all these infections need to be treated early to get good results. If you've already got severely damaged lungs, they probably aren't going to do the job.
Thank you. Yeah, go on to those issues earlier by the sounds of it. Right. Next one, Cole, for you, drenching strategies for very light use. In this example that's come through.
Yeah, okay. Well, very light use. I mean, effectively, most of the drench products or chemicals that we use these days can be used down to about a 10 kilogram animal. So very light use. I probably would steer clear of something like levamisole, because that actually can be quite toxic. A double dose of levamisole will kill sheep. But all your mectins, ivermectin, moxidectin, uh, avermectin, etc., and your white drenches are all quite safe. You can give them 5 times the recommended dose without any significant issues. So I'd be making sure that if you've got very light use, I'd probably just be using a combination drench, which might be a white drench mixed with one of the mectins, and they're all equally safe. So and I'd recommend drenching to weight. So in other words, perhaps go through and draft out the very light ones from the other light ones to make sure you're not giving them an overdose. In most of the dose rates are usually about 1 mil per 10 kilogram body weight, and so just to make sure you follow the dosing on the package, and there shouldn't be a problem.
Thank you. Last question to you is, how do I treat ewes with a lamb at foot that has weak back legs and can't stand up? So wondering whether you know what it is and how they might treat it and what they can do with it.
So is it the ewe with the weak legs or the lamb?
It's the ewe, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. I wonder if it's twins. You don't mention?
Nope, not mentioned.
No,
Just
okay.
says with a lamb. So yep, I'm
Oh,
assuming.
yeah, okay, right out. Because I'm going to say there is a condition known as kangaroo hop, which we do see from time to time. In fact, I was only talking to a producer yesterday that he's got 2 or 3 in his mob, and he was about to go and post-mortem. And I said, well, actually, most of them get over that. And the kangaroo hop is actually usually maternal breeds with twin lambs on a grass pasture, and they get a kangaroo hop. In fact, they actually hop like a kangaroo, and it may go on for months, but invariably they seem to recover, and it doesn't seem to affect the lambs. But in this case, if it's just one ewe with weak hind legs, yeah, look, it could be a number of issues. It could be a mineral deficiency just causing hind limb or lameness. For example, selenium, or even phosphorus deficiency, and/or calcium, copper deficiency. They all cause weak bones or weak strength. And for example, hypocalcemia or milk fever, that can cause animals to be collapse in the back end. and in fact, that's the common scenario. They'll often lie on their brisket with their legs out behind them. The magnesium deficiency can also cause animals to be weak in the hind legs, but usually they'll die from that within a day or two. Whereas calcium deficiency, they tend to linger. And the same with phosphorus deficiency. We call them creepers. They tend to creep along on their haunches, but the phosphorus deficiency sort of prevents them from standing up. So I would suggest if it's just an isolated ewe weak in the hind legs, it's obviously difficult to, might have to milk her out and feed the lamb by hand if they're that keen. But I would be giving her a jab of Flow Pack, which is the 4-in-1, the calcium, magnesium, phosphorus and glucose solution. You normally give about 100 ml under the skin, and I'd repeat that twice a day for a few days, and hopefully she might recover if it's anything to do with the calcium, magnesium, phosphorus. And I'd also give her a vitamin A, D and E injection, because the vitamin D will help enhance the uptake of the calcium and phosphorus. So I think that's the best I could recommend.
Thanks, Cole. Hopefully that producer's got some ideas about what they can do with that ewe, and if they had a few more. So thank you for that. I want to thank all of you for joining for today's webinar. I thank you for your amazing questions that we've had tonight. It was great that we could have this webinar and take the time to answer those questions. So thank you so much for your efforts in getting those questions to me. I want to extend my thanks to both Deb and Colin for sharing your insights and experience and answering all those questions. I thank you for your time and have a lovely evening.